he had this explosion of activity in his home that was seen by his wife. She saw this standing on two legs, a wolf creature, a wolf standing in her yard, its paws crossed like this.
Nell'episodio precedente abbiamo ascoltato diverse testimonianze del giornalista australiano Ross Coulthard. Oggi invece ci immergiamo nell'universo di George Knapp.
All these things that have come out over the last couple of years started right here.
From the anchor desk in the bombshell interview that revealed Area 51 to the front row of a historic congressional hearing, when it comes to the mysteries surrounding UFOs, no one has a more impressive resume than investigative reporter George Knapp.
I have secret stashes of files and things all over the station.
At a time when mobs ruled Sin City and local news was king, George made inroads literally everywhere.
At night when I finished the cab driving shift, I'd go over to this nightclub, which was called the Oz, and all the mob guys were there. All the mob guys from the movie Casino would be there on a regular basis.
But what he's most known for is this moment, which unfolded on live television.
Well, there's several, actually 9 flying saucers, flying discs, that are out there of extraterrestrial origin, and they're basically being dismantled.
A shocking interview that revealed the existence of Area 51.
He tells me this story. The phones go crazy. I get pulled off the set and pulled into the news director's office. The general manager comes back. What the hell was that? Is this for real? What did you just do? I said, look, I don't know if it's real. I have no idea. We just wanted to do an interview, but I'm going to find out.
And ignited conversations around what the government could be hiding.
I have found out that the government has retrieved between 10 and 15 actual flying saucers, 3 of which have been in perfect condition, 1 of which they tried to fly.
From his friendship with well-known pilot John Lear and the late Senator Harry Reid.
There are answers out there, but we're not going to get answers just by hoping they come.
For decades, George broke big stories and interviewed key witnesses.
Ma prima di passare a lui, volevamo ringraziare la nostra piccola ma affiatata community, che ci ringrazia spesso. Ci fa ovviamente piacere che venga apprezzato il lavoro che ci ha portato fino a qua. Abbiamo esaminato il processo di comunicazione della disclosure e cercato di comprendere il quadro generale. Il nostro obiettivo finale è quello di capire chi o cosa siano gli UFO, da dove vengano, i loro intenti, come riescano a spostarsi, quale sia la loro relazione con noi esseri umani, se siano amichevoli, neutrali o ostili, di cosa si nutrono, quali sono i loro valori e che forma di governo hanno. Sappiamo che l'informazione su questo argomento è spesso distorta, ma ci siamo anche resi conto dell'importanza di attori come il Pentagono, il Vaticano e l'ONU. Alla luce di 4 anni di indagini e 8 mesi di attività sul nostro canale YouTube, con 23 episodi e con altri 34 video pubblicati, tra cui numerose testimonianze, alcune delle quali davanti al Congresso, riteniamo che il fenomeno UFO sia autentico e porti con sé implicazioni positive per l'umanità. Le nostre indagini sono iniziate nel 2018 e il nostro canale è stato creato a febbraio del 2023. Il nostro obiettivo principale è stato analizzare, comprendere e spiegare quanto siano credibili le persone coinvolte nella divulgazione degli UFO. Questo perché sapevamo che un giorno avremmo dovuto pubblicare questa puntata. Non per i ringraziamenti, ma perché oggi ci concentriamo sull'aspetto più enigmatico e inquietante di questa realtà. Oggi esploreremo il lato oscuro. Pensavate di aver capito quasi tutto, vero? Ahimè, non è così. E oggi sarete costretti a rivedere le vostre convinzioni. Noi non abbiamo paura dello stigma né di narrare ogni aspetto del fenomeno UFO in tutta la sua complessità, che comprende sfaccettature positive, negative e oscure. Riteniamo che il fenomeno UFO non corrisponde esattamente all'immaginario collettivo, che spesso ne fa un'interpretazione superficiale, rappresentando gli alieni come esseri umanoidi e benevoli provenienti da altri pianeti. George Knapp è un rinomato giornalista investigativo americano del Nevada, lo stato della famosa Area 51, con una carriera prolifica nell'ambito del giornalismo d'inchiesta. È particolarmente noto per il suo lavoro nell'ambito dell'ufologia e dei fenomeni paranormali. Knapp ha condotto ampie ricerche sull'Area 51 e sullo Skinwalker Ranch, portando alla luce informazioni precedentemente sconosciute sulle attività segrete del governo e sugli UFO. La sua audace copertura trentennale ha contribuito a far avanzare la comprensione dei misteri legati agli UFO e ha reso i fenomeni paranormali oggetto di discussione pubblica. La sua carriera giornalistica è stata caratterizzata da numerosi premi e riconoscimenti per il suo impegno nelle indagini e nella divulgazione. Knapp ha collaborato con Colm Kelleher. Colm Kelleher è un biotecnologo con una vasta esperienza in campo scientifico e investigativo. È noto soprattutto per essere stato il program manager del programma Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Application Program, conosciuto anche come OSAP, un'iniziativa governativa che ha studiato fenomeni aerei non identificati. In questa puntata ci concentreremo sui loro racconti riguardanti lo Skinwalker Ranch. Se non avete ancora visto i 2 episodi precedenti che trattano di questo argomento, episodio numero 2 ed episodio 18, vi consigliamo vivamente di farlo prima di procedere con questo episodio. Quando abbiamo iniziato questa serie, abbiamo dichiarato chiaramente di mantenere la mente aperta. Queste testimonianze e questo episodio in particolare sono un esempio lampante di storie assurde e difficili da credere, ma vere, indagate per anni dal Pentagono. Secondo la nostra prospettiva, il processo di divulgazione procede da tanti anni anche a causa del lato inquietante di questa fenomenologia. Infatti, gli americani usano spesso il termine shock ontologico. Nelle prossime puntate affronteremo sicuramente anche il lato positivo, ma non è questo il giorno. Per riassumere, vogliamo sottolineare che diamo una connotazione molto positiva al fenomeno UFO e alle intelligenze non umane, ma oggi ci concentreremo sul lato più assurdo, incredibile, negativo e oscuro. Ritorneremo su questi argomenti in futuro, perché è il nostro desiderio di comprendere appieno tutto lo spettro della fenomenologia UFO. Questa introduzione è stata pensata anche per chi sta vedendo il nostro canale per la prima volta. Infatti, questo non è il video con cui iniziare la vostra esperienza con noi. Non desideriamo che vi sentiate sopraffatti né spaventati. Se avete amici scettici che magari vi prendono un po' in giro per il vostro interesse, non suggeritegli questo video. Pertanto, se è una delle prime volte che visitate il canale, vi invitiamo ad iniziare dal primo episodio. Questo video non è adatto a chi non è al corrente degli eventi degli ultimi 2 anni e non è nemmeno adatto alle menti deboli. Prendete sul serio questa raccomandazione. Non guardate questo episodio in presenza di bambini piccoli. Non è uno scherzo.
George, this one's directed to you. Why don't you explain to the people who are unacquainted what the hitchhiker effect is?
We don't exactly know. And I think a hitchhiker effect should probably be plural, not just a singular form of the term, because there are many effects. The Bass team first noticed it in correlation to things that happened to people who visited Skinwalker Ranch. In particular, there were at least 5, maybe 6 intelligence officials who, during the OSAP program, overseen and funded by the Defense Intelligence Agency, these intelligence officials visited Skinwalker Ranch, had an encounter with something unusual, and then took something home with them. We don't know exactly how it works. We don't know why it happens, but it's happened over and over again. It not only happened to those people during the OSAP Bass period, but it happened to people who had visited the ranch during the NIDS era and even before that, where people would go to this property, encounter unusual phenomena, UFOs, whatever, and then they would go home and they were visited at their home by orbs, by craft, by crypto type beings. Poltergeist type activity broke out in their homes. In one particular instance that we describe in the book, there were these very seasoned intelligence officials who, as part of the Bass OSAP program, went to the ranch to check it out for themselves. They're walking in the middle homestead. At night, it's cold and suddenly gets much colder. They hit a cold spot where the temperature drops dramatically in a matter of seconds, and they were sort of on high alert. In fact, these guys were on high alert the whole time they were on the ranch because they'd read and heard about it. And they encountered some sort of an intelligence that had a sort of a menacing presence. It sort of froze them in their tracks. They backed off, and later when they went home, they had an eruption of paranormal activity in their homes. And generally, the way it works is it spreads to their family members. The family members, wives, children, see these things ahead of time. The one character in our book, Axelrod, not his real name, we had to change that at the direction of the Pentagon when we submitted the manuscript. He had this explosion of activity in his home that was seen by his wife. She saw this standing on 2 legs, a wolf creature, a wolf standing in her yard, its paws crossed like this, leaning on a tree, staring back at her. A couple of days later, she didn't tell anybody about it. A couple of days later, her kids see it. They scream. This thing runs off down the street. They can see it's running on two legs. It's kicking up leaves. And they didn't know what the hell to think about it. But there were other things that happened in the home, beings, shadowy figures seen in the home, things moving around on their own. Their pet had been moved. They found their dog up on the roof one day, all kinds of trickster type activity. And then it spread from the kids to their friends in the neighborhood. That has happened a bunch of times. It happened, there was a female agent who we detail in the book, a very seasoned, battle-hardened professional who encountered something with Column, and he can tell you about it. They encountered some kind of a creature, a crypto creature that people have dubbed the Dino Beaver, again, in the Middle Homestead. This woman, when she goes back home, it's an immediate explosion of what you could call poltergeist type activity. Not saying it is poltergeist, it's just similar to that kind of activity that's been reported over the decades by poltergeist researchers in her home. A wine bottle flies across the room, from one side of the room, smashes on the wall on the other side. There are beings that she sees at the side of her bed, things moving around in her home. It was so dramatic that her roommate, who was her fiance, moved out, ended that relationship. This activity has continued for years. Colin will tell you it's happened to pretty much all of us who've spent a lot of time on the ranch, including me. I've never seen anything on Skinwalker Ranch, but my wife has experienced things at my home. Colin's wife has experienced things in their home. Bob Bigelow's wife experienced things in their home. Some of it is benign and interesting, and some of it is downright scary. We don't know why it happens, but Colin, with his biology background, can explain better about sort of the effect of how it spreads. It's like a virus.
You mentioned it's benign and sometimes deleterious. Is any of it positive?
Not that I know of. Maybe Colin has heard about that. I mean, it's positive in the sense of, wow, I got to see something really strange there. It's kind of thrilling. My wife, the first time something happened at our home, and I tried to make this happen for a long time before I knew about the hitchhiker effect. I would bring things home from Skinwalker Ranch to my house, try to engage whatever it was. Bits of rocks and scrap and things taken from the homesteads, little tiny bits and pieces to try to get it going. And finally it happened, and it wasn't pleasant. My wife saw these blue orbs floating over our house at night. She called me to come up and see them. By the time I got there, they were gone. And then there was an experience in our bedroom where this thing came in. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but it was a very frightening experience for her, unpleasant, and she didn't want it to happen again.
Well, the interesting thing about the hitchhiker effect is that it is very, very reproducible. George said that, back even in the 90s, the NIDS people were experiencing this effect. But in terms of reproducibility, we know that going into between the NIDS era, which ended in 2003, and the BAS era, the OSAP era, which happened really beginning in 2008, 2009, multiple security officers were deployed on the Skinwalker Ranch property. A lot of those people, we've personally interviewed about a dozen of them, and a lot of those people have brought, quote unquote, brought something home. Same kind of thing, poltergeist activity in the house. Sometimes they see orbs in the house. And then getting into the OSAP era, where everything seemed to really escalate, and these 5 out of 5, 100% of the military intelligence people who were deployed at the request of the Defense Intelligence Agency onto Skinwalker Ranch did, as George said, bring something home with them. Even after Robert Bigelow sold Skinwalker Ranch, we have a new era of Brandon Fugel, the property developer from Utah, purchased the ranch. He installed a team on the property, and lo and behold, we have another set of instances of the hitchhiker effect. And remember, the people who went on Skinwalker Ranch in 2016 were very, very skeptical, and they were saying, this is all, this is not absolutely, this is all fantasy. And then stuff started erupting in their homes. They brought something home with them. In terms of reproducibility, the hitchhiker effect has continuously affected people for that we know of for about 25 years. It may be longer on Skinwalker Ranch. And the second point I wanted to make was that it is not only Skinwalker Ranch. It is not sort of only happening on Skinwalker Ranch, but a lot of UFO activity does seem to give rise to the Skinwalker or the hitchhiker effect. For people who have never been on Skinwalker Ranch and just interact with the UFO phenomenon, they themselves, in some cases, I'm not saying in all cases, but in some cases, and mostly where we have the luxury of being able to study these people over many months or many years, a lot of these people, report elements of the hitchhiker effect. It's kind of ironic, but going all the way back to 1947, Kenneth Arnold, when he saw those 9 objects in the sky over the Cascade Mountains in June of 1947. It's interesting, long after he died, his daughter went on a radio show. She was talking about writing a book about his life, but she started talking about seeing orbs in the Arnold home, experienced various poltergeist effects. Even Kenneth Arnold himself in his book talks about some really weird happenings that were happening after the June 24th, 1947. I'm not unambiguously tying what happened to Kenneth Arnold to some form of the hitchhiker effect, but I'm saying that this effect is not just a Skinwalker Ranch specific effect. It happens on a much broader scale.
You've been researching in this area for decades, or at least plenty and plenty of years. What piece of evidence do you find most striking, most remarkable, for whatever reason? So one could be because it's incontrovertible evidence toward the existence of X or Y, or it led to some new research area.
I think one of the most remarkable things that we found during the OSAP program, and again, the OSAP program was a 24-month program that started in 2008 and ended in 2010. But, for the first time, we had a large team. We had about 50 people who were employed full-time at OSAP. And then we had $22 million allocated through the Defense Intelligence Agency for a 2-year period. So it's very rare in the UFO field to have the luxury of resources and being able to study people over long periods of time after they've encountered UFOs. So I guess one of the most remarkable sort of discoveries that we made during the OSAP program was the intense medical effects that some of these UFO cases cause in some people. I'll give you an example. One of the Sentinel cases that we actually investigated over about a year, actually, and it went into almost a 2-year investigation, was that this biotechnologist and his daughter were driving towards Bend, Oregon, in their vehicle on their way home, and the daughter notices 3 small UFOs, bluish color, that were darting around in the field beside them. Once she noticed them, they immediately made a beeline for the vehicle as they were driving. And one of them went right across the windshield. One of them came into the car and went right across, in their field of view, went right across the windshield inside the vehicle. But the third one actually went through the left shoulder of this biotechnologist, went through the upper thoracic cavity, and then emerged from the right shoulder and then shot out through the window right in front of the daughter. I mean, this was a terrifying episode for the daughter, especially. She was witnessing all of this. But, within, I would say, 24 to 48 hours, this guy woke up the following day with the left side of his face was all sunburnt. His ear had started swelling. His eye, he was started losing the sight in his left eye. Within a week or a couple of weeks, he started losing his hair on the left side of his head. And, luckily we had on contract MD, PhD, a couple of MD, PhDs, really sort of as people who could get deep into medical investigations and look at medical injuries. So we deployed one of these people, on this case, and he followed this guy over many, many months. But it turned out that a few months after this event had happened, he came down with a rare form of ductal carcinoma that luckily was not metastatic, so it did not metastasize. And over a 2-year period, went through a lot of health issues. But in terms of being able to document all of that, we were very, very fortunate that we had access to blood samples taken from this guy before the incident. And then there were multiple blood samples taken after the incident. So we were able to piece together a medical forensic sort of picture of what had happened before and after this incident. And we could document, rises and falls of various immune system parameters within this guy. We saw that there were dramatic changes in neutrophil lymphocyte ratios over time. And, this was from an OSAP UFO investigation point of view. We think this was one of the sentinel cases because we had resources and we had the luxury of following this guy over 1.5 to 2 years after the incident. And as I said, we had blood samples taken before the incident. So we were actually able to postulate about cause and effect and the dramatic increase in adverse health symptoms that this guy had suffered. We were able to say with reasonable confidence that he suffered pretty well all of those after the close encounter with this small blue orb. So that was a case, and we had several other cases that BAS OSAP encountered that sort of looked at the medical injury aspect, and that was one of the things that really surprised me. During the NIDS era, we did not encounter too many of those cases. We were all the time databasing cases from, we had about 1,800 separate UFO investigations under our belt by the time the NIDS database went on ice, which was about 2003. But we never saw, in terms of boots in the ground investigations of UFO effects, we never saw the sort of level of medical injury that we saw sort of, up close and personal with a few of these cases. So I guess that's one of the things that really surprised me from the OSAP series of investigations.
Did that person feel any burning sensation or any sensation at all when the orb went through him?
Well, he actually did feel a sort of really weird, sort of uncomfortable. It wasn't painful or anything. He felt sort of discombobulated and sort of out of sorts as this thing was traveling through his body. It was almost like it felt like a very, very large bubble that was moving through his body. He actually did feel the movement, but he didn't feel any pain or he didn't feel any discomfort. He just felt, I would say it was sort of a version of mild vertigo.
George, now what are you referring to? What specifically are you referring to that you feel like people in the media, either on podcasts, etc., haven't picked up on? And why do you think it's so important, those pieces of information? This question also comes from Dan from That UFO Podcast.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of ways I could answer that. I'll give you sort of some bullet points. One is the documenting the difference between OSAP and ATIP. We're all glad that ATIP, that story, hit the New York Times in December 2017. But there were multiple errors of fact in that story that they sort of conflated OSAP with ATIP. OSAP is the program that got $22 million. OSAP was authorized and overseen by the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was not a small operation. As Colm said, it had 50 full-time employees working around the clock and then hundreds of subcontractors. It was huge. As far as we know, we believe there are other UFO programs, but as far as we know, it was the largest such endeavor ever funded by the U.S. government, bigger than Project Blue Book, bigger than ATEP by many magnitudes. And I don't think people get just how big it was. ATIP grew out of OSAP, not the other way around. There were two distinct efforts, and this was huge. Number two is the database. The database that was created by these guys is enormous. It's more than 200,000 different UFO cases. It incorporates not only Project Blue Book and US government files, but also private files compiled by NIDS, the files of other governments, including Brazil, documents, reports, case files, things of that sort. It was enormous. I don't think there's anything like it anywhere else in the world. And had OSAP been allowed to continue, one of the plans was, as envisioned by Jacques Vallée, who created this database or data warehouse, was to put AI on top of it as a way to filter and collate different cases to look for patterns. If that had been allowed to continue, if OSAP had been allowed to continue, we'd be way further down the road in understanding what this phenomena is. As it is, we don't understand it at all. We don't know where it's from, why it's here, what its interest is in us. We don't know what the answers to any of those big questions, but it is possible. They could have been achieved if it had been allowed to continue. Also, the specific cases. Tic Tac is probably the most famous UFO case in the world. That was an OSAP project. They launched that investigation. And although we've seen bits and pieces of what OSAP was able to determine about the Tic Tac, the bulk of that information, the analysis that was done with a specific kind of software, has never been made public. Colin could probably address that a lot better than I can, but let me finish this list. And then there are individual cases, things that happened at Skinwalker Ranch, crypto creatures, the different kinds of craft that were investigated, seen and investigated by OSAP at the ranch and then other places around the country. There's a case in Georgia that was investigated that is mind-boggling. There's a Men in Black type instance that happened in Kentucky that Colin can elaborate on. There's a Southern California incident in Ventura County where an entire family had these experiences over a number of days, saw alien beings, got them on camera, in fact, and it had a kind of a trick ending. But those kind of cases, I don't think they have registered with the general public or the UFO public at all.
Colin, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think exactly what George put out is the case, but the fact is, we submitted 104 separate reports to the Defense Intelligence Agency as separate deliverables during the OSAP program, and only a minority of those reports were focused on Skinwalker Ranch. The remainder of the reports focused on, we did a pretty extensive engineering analysis of the Tic Tac incident, and we compiled a report based on ANSYS multi-physics analysis of the Tic Tac case, computational fluid dynamics analysis. That was a 140 plus page report that was submitted to the Defense Intelligence Agency. That was completely separate from the report that Axelrod submitted on his investigation and his investigation of the Tic Tac effect. So we also had a lot of investigations of things like the Russian UFO papers that George Knapp brought back from Russia. That was completely independent of Skinwalker Ranch. And we employed 3 separate Russian translators. We got a lot of the documentation. We got all of the documentation translated. We had analysts take a look at it, and it was a mind-boggling array of an organizational chart in Russia/Soviet Union in the early 1990s, which showed that the Soviet Union had this massive program that was focused on gathering UFO data nationwide at a national level. Government departments were involved, as well as university departments involved. There was also this military unit called 73790 that was involved, and it seemed to be the sort of the linchpin of the entire investigation. And there've been whispers about Unit 73790 as being sort of fundamental to the Soviet Union and later the Russian focus on the UAP agenda. But you know, Senator Reid, when he was instrumental in forming this program, one of the really sort of alarming things in his mind was the prospect that another country would be gaining traction on the United States. And you know, he had in mind Russia and China, but other countries also, that they were gaining a technological edge because they were actually taking the UFO topic a lot more seriously in these countries than they were in the United States. You know, we have publicly, we know we had Project Sign, we had Project Grudge, we had Project Blue Book, and then sort of laterally we had this very large OSAP program, which unfortunately was prematurely truncated after 2 years, just as it was really sort of getting going. And then we had this very small effort in the Pentagon called ATIP, you know, so in terms of the publicly available knowledge of how seriously the United States government was taking the UFO phenomenon, the Thread 3 documents that OSAP translated and analyzed shows pretty unequivocally that the Soviet Union / Russia had a much more serious and wider scope program.
2 questions. Number 1, do other countries have the same after effects, specifically the archetypal beasts, as North America, because it seems culturally specific? And then, well, let's tackle that one first.
Well, for example, Bigfoot, if you talk about crypto creatures, has been seen everywhere in the world. I think maybe Hawaii might be the only place where something like it hasn't been seen, and I could be wrong there. So a lot of the crypto type creatures that we see here, dogmen, wolfmen, you know, creatures that are were creatures, they've been seen all over the world in every culture. So there are a lot of similarities. I think there are specific kinds of crypto creatures that are unique to different parts of the world. We've seen at Skinwalker, we've seen a mix of them. I mean, it almost gets bizarre and ridiculous. There are creatures that have been seen there by the ranchers and property owners, neighbors, that don't exist in nature. Colum saw one of them. Colum experienced that walking with the female intelligence officer in the middle homestead at the ranch, and they saw what people have laughingly called a dino beaver. Colum, maybe you want to tell that story, what this thing looked like?
Yeah, I was I was on the property with Robert Bigelow and with the person in the book who was a defense and intelligence analyst. Her name was Juliet Witt, and you know, during the day, Juliet and I had walked the property. We had done a lot of photography of the property. I had briefed Juliet on the various incidents that had happened during the National Institute for Discovery Science program on the ranch. Juliet climbed up on top of the Skinwalker Ridge, which is the northern property, or the northern part of the ranch, and she took a lot of photographs. So that night at about 10 o'clock, myself, Robert Bigelow, and Juliet went down to an area near Homestead Number 2, which is kind of the center of the ranch, but also the location where over the last 25 years, there have been literally dozens of anomalies reported and recorded and witnessed. So what we did was we had chairs with us. We sat out in the middle of a pasture near Homestead 2, about probably, I don't know, 50 feet away from Homestead 2. And the way the chairs were oriented were we were back to back to back. So each one of us was facing in a 60 degree angle away from each other. So we could essentially cover the entire 360 degrees. So we noticed, myself and Robert Bigelow noticed that Juliet was really getting, you know, she was getting pretty jumpy because, you know, it was very, very dark. It was, you know, you could see the faint light of homesteads way in the distance. And we were sitting out, sort of sitting ducks in her mind, and I guess in our minds too, sitting ducks for anything that wanted to sort of pass by. So she was getting pretty nervous. So Robert Bigelow sort of got up and walked down. He was strolling down about 100 yards south. So I got up to, to head over to the opposite direction, in the direction of the Homestead 2 building, which is an abandoned homestead about 100 years old. That's kind of like in ruins. So about 30 feet in front of me, I see this, what looks like a maybe somewhere between 100 to 150 pound creature that's motoring along the tree line in front of me. It's about 30 feet away. I looked over at Juliet Witt, and she's looking at it too. And this thing looked like it had like blocks on the spine, emanating from the spine. I guess the nearest equivalent I can think of in terms of what I was looking at is a very, very small version of a stegosaurus. But I could see also, and this was very, very dim light, this creature was motoring north, and it was absolutely silent. It had what looked like a flat tail, low to the ground, and it was a pretty bulky creature. I mean, it was small, but it was pretty bulky. And my estimate, in hindsight, is probably somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds. But what the most bizarre aspect of this whole thing was that it was like a cone of silence had descended on the, on this whole area. And, even the crickets, this kind of ambient noise out on Skinwalker Ranch when you're sitting there for hours, all of that had stopped. There was no noise whatsoever. And this thing was motoring north. It should have been rustling and, leaves and grass as it went by. It was maybe, I'm guessing about 30, maybe 40 feet away from me. It was probably 50 feet away from Juliet. So we watched this thing. It made a beeline for the corner of the abandoned Homestead 2 and went behind it. And it was like, probably a few seconds later, myself and Juliet sort of went right over to try to follow this thing to get a better view of it. And we couldn't see any sight of it. We went around the corner of the building, turned right, and there's a sort of a gap between the corner of the building and a set of trees that eventually ends up on the track that goes east-west on Skinwalker Ranch. We could not see any sign of this creature, but it's kind of like the moment in time was pretty short. Maybe, I don't know, probably less than 30 seconds when we were looking at this. There was absolute silence, and it was like a sort of a version of shock when you're seeing something like this. And then by the time it got behind the building, I mean, if we had the ultimate sort of planning, move into high gear instead of being involved with this Oz effect, we could have got the night vision binoculars out. We searched for the creature with night vision binoculars, but we couldn't find anything. But this is an example of the kind of thing that happens on Skinwalker Ranch.
There's a story that we told in Hunt for the Skinwalker, and Colin and I debated about it. Geez, do we include this one? Because it's pretty crazy. It was the witnesses are police officers. They're cops, in tribal police.
Right.
And they come around a corner at night up on the paved road up or near the dirt road that you take into the ranch. And they see these figures standing in trench coats, smoking cigarettes. And they shine a light on them, and they're dogs. And we had to debate, do we put this in, that these two dogs are smoking cigarettes?
Why this is something that isn't something we should report on. Like if we get, some sort of definitive knowledge in some way, man, I don't know. I'm being honest right now. I'd light it up.
What if it turns out that aliens made us, that space aliens have been manipulating our DNA, that we are a lab experiment? What if it turns out that interdimensional beings are like Santa Claus? They know when you've been bad or good. They know when you're sleeping. They watch you in the shower, when you're in bed, at your most private moments, sitting on the toilet, that they're always among us, that they can come in and out of our world, that they control our world on a mass scale, and there's nothing we can do about it. Are people ready to handle that?